Hello and welcome. I'm Kath McKenzie, Executive Manager, Community Engagement and Communications at Northern Beaches Council, and your convener tonight. Council's hosting this information session to provide scientific information on 4G and 5G infrastructure. It's an opportunity to get answers to some questions and gain an understanding about these technologies. I hope the information shared by the scientific panel is beneficial to you. Before I introduce our panel members, I'd like to go over some quick housekeeping. Just letting you know that all attendees will be on mute. As you can tell, I ran into that problem, just to ensure that we get clear audio. We'll be responding to many questions that we've already received through the registration process. And before we try to take any more tonight, I apologise in advance if we don't get a chance to address your question, but I do encourage you to visit the ARPANSA website and check out the Talk to the Scientist service for more information. I'll also apologise for any mispronunciations I may make tonight, but I'll certainly do my best. If we get time, we'll certainly take a few more questions that can be submitted via the chat function. We just ask that everybody uses respectful language. Letting you know that this event is being recorded and will be available to view on Council's website. A link will be shared with all the registered attendees in the days following tonight's event. Now to get underway with our introductions, tonight we are joined by industry experts. Associate Professor Sarah Logren, who is the Director of the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, ARPANSA, looks after their activities under the government's Enhanced Electromagnetic Energy Program. The organisation is the government's primary authority on radiation protection and nuclear safety. Associate Professor Logren is also a member of the World Health Organisation Radio Frequency Environmental Health Criterion Evaluation Committee and is an elected member of the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation Protection's ICNIRP's Scientific Expert Group. We're also lucky to have with us Professor Rodney Croft, Director of the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, Centre of Research Excellence into Radio Frequency Electromagnetic Frequency Health, and Chair of the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation Protection. Rodney led the development and recent publication of ICNIRP's Radio Frequency Electromagnetic Frequency Guidelines and regularly contributes to the community via the provision of guidance on non-ionising radiation and health. Rodney's been working in the field of bioelectric magnetic research since 2000 and since then has focused on determining potential adverse effects of radio frequency electromagnetic field exposure on human brain function. I'd like to thank you both for your time tonight. Firstly, Associate Professor Logren, can you give us a quick overview of the role and the work of ARPANSA? And I believe you'll be sharing a presentation with us.
I've just uploaded that, so hopefully everybody can see that and now hear me. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Northern Beaches Council and Kath for extending the invitation to speak with you all today, a little bit about what we do and also a little bit about radio frequency technology and some of the concerns that the community might have in this space. So I'm just going to give a short presentation to give you an idea of who we are at ARPANSA and what our role is and what other government agencies' roles are in this space. A really brief overview of wireless technology, because that's one of the key reasons why we're all here today. What the safety limit actually is, and there's a little bit of confusion around that. A little touch on the science behind all of this, and then we'll move into all of the questions that you may have submitted, and if there's time, questions that you may ask during this event. So I think, as Kath already mentioned, ARPANSA is the Australian Government's primary authority on radiation protection and nuclear safety. So it's not only wireless technologies that we're responsible for, but we're responsible for all types of radiation. A couple of the key things that we're involved in, or that we do, is that we produce the safety standards for Australia in terms of radio frequency, and we also are responsible for a lot of the research and science in this space. So if we just look for a little bit of clarification, because it can get a little bit confusing when we talk about the government and what each arm of the government does. ARPANSA doesn't do everything, so we contribute to research, we produce the safety standard in this space, and we also are responsible for providing evidence-based public health advice. But when it comes to the regulation of wireless technology, that's actually the role of the Australian Communications and Media Authority, or the ACMA, and the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications are the ones that have policy responsibility for wireless technology. So as you can see, there's a number of different arms of government that are involved in this space. So in terms of wireless technology, just a brief introduction into what it is. I know we've probably all seen one of these base stations before, but I've mentioned radio frequency, and Kath has mentioned it in the introduction as well. And radio frequency electromagnetic energy is what wireless technology uses to work. So 4G, 5G, 3G, and some of the earlier, or all of the earlier iterations of wireless telecommunication use radio frequency electromagnetic radiation, or sometimes we call this radio waves, in order for them to work. It's used by radio, it's used by television, and also things like Wi-Fi that you're all familiar with. Radio waves are known as non-ionizing radiation, and what that simply means is that they don't have enough energy to break chemical bonds or damage our DNA or cells, whereas ionizing radiation has this ability. So radio waves at high levels, though, can heat our biological tissue or our bodies, and that can potentially cause damage. But the levels that telecommunications or all of the devices that we're exposed to as public are far too low to produce any significant heating or damage or increase to our body temperatures. So the other thing that I've mentioned is the safety limit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how that works. So from an international perspective, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, or ICNIRP, is responsible for producing guidelines in this space, and it updated the radio wave guidelines in 2020. And as Kath mentioned, Professor Rodney Croft led that work, and he's here today to answer any questions in relation to that. So the guidelines have been updated very recently. ICNIRP, for those who aren't aware of who they are regarded as the leading international health authority on non-ionizing radiation protection. And in terms of the literature or the science that the guidelines were based on, you can see in those guidelines what the levels are where harm might occur, and that's how the guidelines are set to ensure that harm does not occur. So if we look more locally in terms of the Australian safety limit, so ARPANSA is responsible for setting the Australian safety limit, and we updated our safety limit as well based on the recent guidance from ICNIRP. The safety limits are conservative and they're set much lower than the level at which harm is known to occur. And there's no established scientific evidence that exposure to radio frequency from wireless technology below these safety limits can cause health effects. So every mobile phone base station, including the 4G and 5G base stations, must meet this Australian standard and safety limit, which is designed to protect people against exposure to radio waves. And we continue at ARPANSA to conduct research and also review the science regularly to make sure that these safety limits remain fit for purpose. So just to give you an idea of the Australian standard and how it's set and the typical exposure that you might receive in the public from radio waves from different devices, you can see that Wi-Fi is well below where the standard sits, as is TV, mobile phones and radio. And like I said, there's a big safety factor built in to the Australian standard, so harm only occurs well above the standard. So when we do measurements, we see that the exposure that we get from our everyday devices is far below the safety limit and even further below where we know harm can occur. So the science, just to touch on the science, a little bit from an ARPANSA perspective, we've got some pictures here of some of the teams. So while we're a small team, we do quite a little bit of science, and one of, I think, the most interesting things for the forum tonight of what we do is measurements. So continuing to monitor radio waves in the environment from these wireless telecommunications devices. So you can see in one of these pictures looking at our measurement devices and measuring what's actually happening in the real world in real time. And we've published a number of these studies in recent years as well, showing that across time, exposure to radio waves hasn't increased like a lot of people might have expected, because we do have a lot more devices now, and people often assume that the higher frequencies that are used in 4G and 5G technologies might lead to higher exposures, but our independent scientific surveys that we have been doing haven't shown that that's the case, and we continue to monitor these radio wave exposures throughout the community. And just lastly, I wanted to touch on how do we actually assess the available science. Obviously, our PANZA doesn't do all the science. The science is done internationally. But when we do evaluate the science to produce things like our safety standard, there's a number of important considerations when assessing all of the evidence. So one of the big things is the quality of the studies. There are lots and lots of studies out there, and not all of them are high quality studies. And so when you're evaluating whether there's an effect or not, you really need to take into consideration the quality of the study that you're looking at. It's really important as well that if a result is real, it should be able to be replicated. And that's another important thing to look at when you're evaluating the science. Also, the different types of studies. If an effect is real, you would expect to see this effect across different types of studies, whether they're performed in cells or animals or on humans, or epidemiological studies where we're surveying the population. It's also, if there is an effect, it's important to be able to identify a mechanism for how does this effect actually happen. And lastly, dose response is very important when it comes to science. So what you would expect to see if an effect was real was the higher the exposure, the higher the risk of an effect. So these are a number of things that need to be taken into account when evaluating the science. So I'm going to leave it there. We'll move to questions, and thank you for your time, and I hope some of that's been informative for you all.
Thank you, Sarah. And Professor Croft, I wanted to sort of explore with you from an international perspective, are the standards the same? And if not, perhaps could you explain why not?
Look, there are differences around the world. The way that the organisations work around the world is very much to provide the scientific evidence and the knowledge about safety. But it's not up to organisations like the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation to decide for a particular country what limits they have. All that we can do is say, look, this is what the science says, now it's up to you. Some countries decide that even though the ICNIRP guidelines show quite conclusively that there's no harm below them, they might decide, well, for whatever reason, we don't trust that. We would like to have a different limit. And at the end of the day, we're different societies. We make choices, not always based on science. And what we have around the world are people basing decisions on very different things. But for those that base it on the science, we actually do see very consistent limits, be it in the UK, France, Australia, Germany. It's very consistent limits around the world. The countries don't find any problems. I can't see any reason why someone would adopt a different limit, but at the end of the day, I would just say these are normal societal democratic processes that decide what limits should be. All that the scientists can do is provide the evidence.
I think we're hearing a lot at the moment about the shift from 3G to 5G, and we're hearing a lot about 3G, perhaps even by Telstra being deferred for its shutdown to allow people to change over. Could you just explain a bit about the difference in that technology? Because I think that's where we're hearing a little bit of concern in the community that 5G has a intensity in its higher frequency that could be harmful. Could you explain a bit more around the science, perhaps? Professor Rodney Croft, you might like to take that one?
Sure. Yes. So essentially, there are lots of quite subtle differences between the different technologies, but most of what is happening are very small changes in frequencies, which operate using the same mechanisms. They're very well understood, whether we're talking about 1G, 2G, 3, 4, or 5G, but they've been designed more efficiently so that they don't need to provide as much energy in order, and thus radiation to people, in order to enable communication. So if, for instance, you use the same amount of energy as you used to use 10 years ago, you can actually get a lot more information transferred. When it comes to health from these different technologies, the difference is really just in penetration depth in the body. As the frequency changes, the penetration becomes more superficial. So with the really old mobile phones, they could penetrate more deeply into the body, whereas with things like 5G, it's filtered out by the outside of the body, mostly the skin. So we actually get less of the radiation into the deeper into the body with the newer technologies than we did with the old ones. Now, in terms of intensity, there isn't actually any difference. The intensity, if you have a frequency that's maybe 1 million times faster, then we're talking about a completely different type of radiation. But that's not what any of these technologies are using. In fact, as we increase from 4G to 5G, we're using pretty much the same frequencies as we used with 4G. There are possibilities of enhancing connectivity in the future with even higher frequencies, but in Australia, they're really not being used. Okay, but there are some trials in some places. There are some places in the world that are using them quite regularly, and so there are differences there. But in terms of the higher frequency, it's still only very small and still using the same mechanism that what we're as the older technologies. And in fact, we'd have to increase the frequency to then get up to infrared radiation, and then we get to optical radiation, and then ultraviolet. We'd have to go so far beyond the visual spectrum before the intensity would actually become relevant to harm. So that's definitely not something that we're actually doing with newer technologies of mobile telecommunications.
Thanks for that explanation. And I think, I guess some people are raising concern. It's a new technology, or relatively new. What long-term studies are there then, I guess, to verify or to disprove any of these sorts of theories about the harm that can be caused?
Well, there's been a lot of long-term studies over the years. I think what people often want to see is a study on their very particular form of 5G mobile phone, or, you know, they want something that matches the actual technology. What the science does, though, is try to understand the mechanisms underneath. Okay, the mechanisms underneath are the same. We've been doing this research for, 70, 80 years as a community, I guess, but particularly in the last 20 odd years, there's just been so many thousands of studies trying to understand if there are any effects that we've missed. But what they're doing is identifying how the radiation from the phone interacts with the body. As we change frequencies, we then have research understanding how the change in frequency affects the body, but we don't actually say, let's look at that particular instance of a 5G phone and try to get an answer for that, because well, bottom line is no two 5G exposures are the same. The very nature of the technology is that it always varies. It's varying based on how good your reception is, how many people there are around, a whole lot of subtle things to help manage the amount of energy that needs to go out. So it's actually impossible to get two identical 5G exposures. So what we do is test archetypal or prototypical exposures, like we might look at a 5 gigahertz signal and we might try modulating a 5 gigahertz signal in a particular way. Then we might play around to do some complicated forms of that to see if any of them are doing anything beyond what we already understand about the science. So we're able to draw on many years of research in this field in order to satisfy ourselves that what we're talking about here is really the same as what we've had since AM and FM radio.
Thanks. There have been a few questions that we received about, do these safety limits also protect the environment? And in particular, reference was even made to honeybees.
Look, the environment is handled differently, and so it's quite an interesting thing. The research out there has been, well, there certainly is a small handful of research studies out there looking at the environment, but the vast majority of it has looked at, for instance, animals to see if they can be affected rather than looking at an ecosystem, for instance. So, you know, in principle, it could be that even though one bee's not affected, it could be that subtle changes in a whole colony could have an effect. So far, the research into bees hasn't been able to identify any such effects. And likewise, the research into other areas hasn't been able to identify any adverse effects. So we believe that, well, there's certainly no evidence of adverse effects to the environment, but it's certainly not researched as thoroughly as it is for animals individually and for humans.
We've received a number of questions that have raised concerns about how safe is it for mobile phone towers to be constructed near homes, schools and hospitals, and in particular things like playgrounds. I guess, how is that being monitored and measured? And in particular, you know, Sarah, I'd love to hear from you on this, and Arpanza, how do we know what the effect from upgrading to 5G technology might be?
Yeah, so for every base station that is deployed, it has to comply with the Australian safety standard, and that is monitored by the Australian Communications and Media Authority, like I mentioned before. So in terms of anything that is installed, any new infrastructure that is installed must comply with those safety limits. In terms of checking that it complies, that is not part of Arpanza's remit, that is the ACMA's remit. However, as I mentioned before in the presentation, it is something that we have a keen interest in, and we are monitoring this, especially in Melbourne, because that is, you know, where we're located primarily. And we are monitoring this over time. So as I mentioned, we have a couple of different types of studies that we've been looking at. Studies where we have monitored measurements from around 2012, and we looked again in 2022, and we will go to those exact same places again in the future to look at whether there are any changes. And so from that particular study, we didn't see any significant changes in the levels of environmental exposure, despite the fact that we've had technology changes across that time. So similar to what we're having now, where we're phasing out 3G and introducing 5G, across the measurement period, 2G was phased out and 4G was introduced, and we didn't see any noticeable or significant differences in that amount of environmental exposure. We've also been conducting studies on microenvironmental exposure, which is more of a personal exposure metric, where we have researchers with an exposure meter that go throughout cities, but also different types of areas. So whether that be on public transport, rural areas, lots of different areas to look at what would a personal exposure level be. And again, it's very, very low. And we've also done this across many years as well, and not seen any significant changes in the levels of exposure. And for both of these studies, the majority of measurements are at 1% or below the level of the safety standard. And in fact, the ACMA as well, they have something that they've introduced last year called an EME checker. And this is publicly available, so anybody can access their EME checker. And what they are doing, and obviously on a much larger scale than us, because they are responsible for regulating this, they are doing measurements and often more than one. So they will come back and measure a site again and again. And with this EME checker, you're able to put in a location or look for a location and see the level that has been measured there, whether there's any change over time as well. And in terms of the measurements that they've been taking across the country, there is nothing so far that has exceeded, I think it's about 3.2% of the Australian safety limit. So everything is well below where that safety limit is set.
We have had a few questions where people have been asking, are these studies published? So is that EME checker the best source of information?
Well, there's the EME checker, and I believe it may have just been popped into the chat for everybody to have a look at, and so you can look at that. There is another way that the public can access measurements across their area, and that's known as the RFNSA. I think I've got that right. And so you can, and I might get David or Kate to put that into the chat as well. So you're able to go in there and put in a location and see measurement for your area. And again, but you can actually see extra information as well. So you can see information around the deployment and I think predictions of when deployment was made in the EME report that is generated by our PANZA through the RFNSA. So that's another avenue that's publicly available, and people are able to go and check wherever they want to check, whether it's their location or any location they just might be interested in.
I think there's a question that had popped into the chat about reports showing significant radio frequency and electromagnetic radiation exposure and increases when base stations are being upgraded to 5G. Is what you're saying is that there's no trend that you're seeing scientifically or in the measurements? Could you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, and like I said, we're not the only ones measuring this, but certainly from our own measurements, and we've been doing a lot in the 5G measurement space as well, we have not seen any clear trend of exposures going up. And I think Rodney may have alluded to this earlier as well, that actually as technology advances, they actually become more efficient. So in general, what we would have had years and years ago, you would have probably expected more exposure from that, because the newer technologies are much more efficient. They're able to do things much more efficiently, and they have lots of things that they employ to actually reduce a person's exposure. And again, what we're seeing across all of our studies is no significant changes in exposure despite the changes in technology. They're staying pretty stagnant over the years.
Thanks. Professor Croft, just going back to that point you made about the old technologies versus the new technologies and potential absorption, can you just explain, has there been greater risks in the past, or is it that everything has still been below what were the recommended standards?
Yeah, look, in the past, everything was also well below. So it's not that there was a big risk in the past that's reducing. It's just that exposures have always been low. Certainly when Sarah was starting to do research in this area, it was mostly on 2G systems, and things haven't changed. So we still get the same results that we've had for many years. I think the bottom line is it's just such a small amount of radiation that it isn't enough to do anything appreciably.
And we've also heard in the past, even household devices like your microwave, etc. I mean, EMEs are around us in lots of applications. You know, are they still the sort of devices that you should be getting checked? Or what's the risk, I guess, from those household appliances people might have every day?
The exposures are still very small. In fact, I mean, that's also something that that we did look at in a couple of studies, looking at devices in homes to understand what the highest exposures were. And look, everything was very small. I think microwave ovens, actually, potentially leaky microwave ovens, were in some homes quite high, but even that was still only 10% of the guidelines. So still well below what could actually harm you. So to be honest, it's never occurred to me to check a microwave because I just figure, well, it's only 10%, so it doesn't really matter. But it should be a little bit less than that. But now in homes, you know, you'll look at Wi-Fi, you look at baby monitors, garage openers. These are all things that use essentially the same electromagnetic radiation. What you usually find is that things like radio and television tend to come up about the highest. It seems to be more so in Australia than other countries, and certainly we've done research comparing different countries with these things, and this seems to be an Australian thing. Other countries, I'm not sure how they deal with it. Maybe they have smaller transmitters because the geography is much more reduced in Europe, for instance. But here, certainly, it's the old-fashioned things that actually produce the largest radiation for the community. But I should say, still very low compared to the limits, which are, as Sarah pointed out, very low compared to what it's required to actually cause harm.
And then when we're been looking through the questions we've received, there's a number that raise concerns about the impact on health and brain function. You know, are there studies that have been shown, and people have referenced a few. Sarah made reference that it's important to look at the quality of studies. How do you determine, I guess, which studies are relevant, and, you know, to what degree? You've already said there are no adverse health effects, but I guess that's what people are concerned about. So how can we, I guess, provide them with some information on that?
Okay, look, bottom line is it's really difficult. One of the things that, I don't know if Sarah wants to comment on this, but work she's been doing with the World Health Organization reviewing this literature has taken, I don't know, 8 years or 10 years maybe, and they're still not quite finished. It's a lot of work and it's not trivial. There are so many things that can go wrong in research, and there are many things that people often don't think too much about when they do the research, but it means that at the end of the day, when you get the results in, you often can't do anything with them. So what you're often doing is going back through the literature, trying to identify whether the flaws are big or only small. If they're only small, maybe, okay, well, let's keep that and we'll try to incorporate that. But if they're really large, so for instance, many studies, although they provide sophisticated statistics, may not even provide a statistic that can tell the difference between a random chance like tossing a coin. Okay, there's always going to be an increase or a decrease. You measure someone's immune function one day and the next, it's going to be bigger one day. It's always going to be like that. What we need is to be able to say it's reliably above that. Statistics become very important for that. If we can't differentiate between a coin toss and a real effect, we can't do much with that research. So bottom line is, I don't think I can give an easy answer there. We'd spend at least the next hour, but I see another hand raised there. Perhaps we should pass it over.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Rodney was saying, that there's a number of ARPANSA is not the only one, obviously, monitoring this. So there's a number of international government and health agencies that are continually monitoring this, as well as your big international bodies like ICNIRP and the World Health Organization. So despite the fact that the World Health Organization have spent, the last 10 years doing a really significant and thorough review of this work, it's actually also being reviewed, in an ongoing fashion that would, if anything had come up that was even uncertain, it would also come out. It's not that we're going to be, okay, we're going to wait 10 years until we've reviewed everything thoroughly. Each international agency, governmental agency that is doing this is doing it in a similar way and coming out with similar results each year. So looking at the new research that comes out each year, there are many governments that are doing this, not just ARPANSA, and the consensus is the same each year as well, that there is still no substantiated evidence of any harm from the radio frequency that's associated with these technologies.
A question that's popped into the chat is, do you take into account cumulative exposure, 3G, 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, satellite, RF, EMR levels?
Yes, I mean, the research and the standards as well take into account cumulative exposure. So it's not just that, one exposure, and as long as it complies with the safety limit, then you're fine. But as I think the important point to point out here as well is that from all of the public exposure that we have seen and that we have measured, for the most part, these are at 1% of the safety limit or below from potentially a single device or a single frequency or range of exposure. So even if everything was at 1% of the limit and you're exposed to 10 devices and you added those up, you're still only at 10%, you're still well below. And the reality is that most things are also well below 1% of the limit. So, that's also often looking at a worst case scenario. So there isn't anything generally that's, even approaching close to the limit. So there's no concern there about, well, if I'm using one device, should I turn everything else off because maybe I'm going to exceed my exposure? That's definitely not a concern that anyone needs to worry about.
Thanks for that. Another question that's come up a few times, and we'll get to one that's in the chat, but and I guess it's about the composition of tonight's forum, about why the community independent experts aren't in attendance. So perhaps you could give us a bit of an explanation about how the industry advice is structured.
You want me to take that one?
Sure.
So
thanks, Sarah.
Look, I think, there's a number of different ways that events like this can happen. But in terms of this event that was organised by the Northern Beaches Council, it was a request from at least ARPANSA's side that if we were to participate, that we would participate alongside experts in the field. So people that have clear expertise in the field. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people in the community that have an interest in this topic. However, I think that when you start to open up these forums to a whole lot of different opinions, that they can sometimes go off track from what we're trying to achieve, which is we're trying to achieve education. We're trying to help alleviate concern in the community where concern doesn't need to be. So when we know that there's no health or safety issues with these devices, and when you start opening forums up like this to other areas, then you can sometimes get off track from that messaging. And that's certainly not what we wanted to happen here. We really wanted to alleviate the public's concerns and fears around this technology. We are the government's primary authority on radiation protection, and these are the facts, and we wanted to be able to present them in a way that wasn't challenged by people that don't have expertise in this field.
The question that popped into the chat was, why was ORSA, which I'm not familiar with, and you both may be, made up of scientific researchers not invited. Could you might know a bit more about that body?
Yeah, look, I think the answer remains the same, that we have significant expertise in this country and representation across the main international health bodies like the WHO and ICNIRP, and that is the type of expertise that we want talking and presenting to the community on issues like this. And there are lots of other groups and organisations that just don't have this expertise, and it doesn't help the conversation to include that. So that's why I think, you know, we've got two significant experts in the field that across the international space and all of the significant international bodies that are working in this field, and that's really what the public needs to hear.
Thanks for that. Obviously, some people might have some ongoing concerns about the effects from radio wave exposure. What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, I think it's normal. There's a lot of information out there. It depends on where you look, on what you find. You can sort of find information that tells you anything these days, you know, in the society that we're in, social media. There's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of stuff out there that's just incorrect. So it wouldn't surprise me if people still had concerns after a forum like this. They've heard a little bit now. I hope that it has allayed maybe some potential concerns or fears. But if people still do have some questions that they're unsure about, or things that they want to know, we have plenty of fact sheets on our PANZA website that cover most of these topics. But you can also go to other international reputable bodies like the World Health Organization, who also have a lot of information on this. Also, if you want to talk to somebody, we have a Talk to a Scientist program that runs on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where you're able to contact us and ask us any question about radiation protection, no matter how little or small. And we're open to all questions, and we have a number of expert scientists that are there to answer your questions. You can also email our Talk to a Scientist program as well. If you don't want to talk to us, you can email us, and we're very happy to answer any questions or concerns that the community might have.
Thank you. A question in the chat for you, Professor Croft. If we measure in microwatts per square metre, what do you regard as low before it does harm? And could you confirm that Australia's limit is 10 million microwatts per square metre?
10 watts per square metre. I'd have to convert that across, and it would depend on the particular situation. So there are a whole lot of different. You see, I mentioned before that frequency has an effect on the penetration depth. So we need to have different limits that change a little bit as a function of frequency. So some of the limits change as a function of frequency. Some of the limits change as a function of duration. So having a very brief burst of energy has a different effect to having a continuous exposure that's 24/7. So we have different limits for all of these things. We have different limits for arms and the head and the body. So it's not simply a matter of having one limit. But you know, if there's a particular situation that someone's interested in, I'm happy to check the ICNIRP limit for that particular situation.
Great, thanks for that. There's been a few various studies all referenced in the questions that have been coming in. I'll start with a 10-year US study by NIH on rodent studies. I'm not sure if Professor Croft, you're familiar with that one?
Yes, certainly. So that was a study looking at chronic exposure to mice and rats and looking to see whether there were any effects on a variety of different cancers. bottom line is they reported that there are no effects on male or female mice, no effects on female mice, but reported that there was a very particular cancer, cardiac schwannoma, which is not very, it's extremely rare in humans, but they reported that there was an effect on that. That was the principal finding that came out, and some have taken that as evidence that there is that radio frequency emissions are carcinogenic or cancer producing. Bottom line is, it's another one of those studies, unfortunately, that wasn't actually equipped to be able to answer the question better than chance. So we just aren't able, unfortunately, to look at that. And we can see that of their nearly 10,000 tests they did, we can see that there's a couple that appear to have differences, but we would expect by chance alone to have lots of changes occur. So we can't really tell the difference from the chance and the real. And so when we then compare that to the rest of the literature and we see that that finding is not consistent with it, it makes us think it probably is just chance, okay? But as with all science, it's interesting, someone's put a claim up there, so it's great to test it. So now there are a couple of countries that are looking at this to see whether they can find any evidence. There were really two things. There was that, and the other thing was that they actually found that the rats lived longer if they were exposed to RF. And so they're also looking to see that, because there's a few theories about that actually potentially could make sense, that suggest that you may actually expect to see the animals live longer under RF exposure. So these are being followed up. We're expecting results to come out pretty soon. I think probably next few months rather, with BioEM maybe. There's an international conference once a year, which is the most likely place for this to be presented. So it'd be interesting to see if there's anything that comes out of that. But at the moment, all we have is a limited study, and we really need to look to the overall scientific literature to try to put it into place and see whether it makes any sense. And at the moment it doesn't, but you know, who knows what science will throw up in the future.
There's also a comment about a 5G EMF appeal, which you may be aware of in the international space. I guess, where does that sit in the discussion?
Okay, look, it's not the kind of thing that we'd consider at ICNIRP because it's not a scientific document. This is essentially it's a group of people saying that they want to reduce limits for electromagnetic energy, and that's fine. But that's not what we do as ICNIRP, or that's not what I do as a scientist. All I'm interested in is the science. I certainly don't see anything of relevance to health in that document. I think it is an appeal, and that's appropriate. It's good that people appeal for what they believe in, but I don't see anything in there that's relevant to the debate.
Thanks for that. A couple of the questions that we've had as well just come back to some real fundamentals. Is it safe to sleep at night with my phone on 5G? I mean, Sarah, you might have some advice for people with these questions about their everyday use of their devices, and which band should I be using, 4G, 5G, etc.?
Yeah, that's a question that we get a lot, actually, particularly the sleep one. And people, not just with 5G, people have been concerned or asked us this question across many years of, is it okay to sleep next to my phone? And the answer is yes. So regardless of whether you're using your phone or not, if you're not using it, then it's not transmitting. Every now and then it'll make contact with the base station just to say, hello, I'm still here and turned on, but it's not transmitting, so it's not doing anything. However, even if it was there and it was transmitting, like we've said already tonight, that even while you're using it, it is well below the safety limits. And in terms of the radiation exposure, there is no harm caused by having it next to your bed or using 4G, 5G. There really is no difference in terms of the radiation. What I would add, though, given that my background is in sleep, is that while the radiation might not have any effects, using your phone before sleep, the light from your phone, but also the engagement of, whatever you're doing, excitingly text messaging someone or playing games or whatever, that may impact your sleep. Nothing to do with the radiation, but I would recommend you don't use your phone in the hour or so leading up to bedtime, because that's definitely not good sleep hygiene, as we would say as sleep experts. So yeah, not a radiation issue, but if you want to get a good night's sleep, maybe just turn your phone off or onto do not disturb, so that you're not tempted to check the news or something like that.
Thanks for that. And a final question we've got there, and maybe this is for you, Professor Croft. It's asking for a comment on the Lyon, France, May 31, 2011 WHO International Research on Cancer, classifying radio frequency electromagnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans, group 2B. You might be able to explain a bit of that for us.
Certainly. So IARC routinely classify various agents to say whether they're likely to cause cancer or not. There's a series of options for them. They don't actually have an option which does not cause cancer, but it really comes down to how convinced they are that something does. So you can have a yes, you can have a probably, you can have a possibly, you can have a, well, the research is pretty bad, we don't know. What it came out with was 2B, which is possibly carcinogenic. So depending on how you look at it, you can compare it to lead, as I think one of the questions did, or you can compare it to pickled vegetables, which is something that other people compare it to, all 2Bs. And with that, though, I don't think it gives you a lot of information. I think that when you look at the actual method that they've used, and you say, is there anything in their method that arrives at a 2B that actually shows there's research showing that RF causes cancer, you have to say no. So their system does not show that RF causes cancer. What they have found is that there are some studies that report epidemiological associations, which can't determine causation. There are much better studies that look for the same thing and can't find associations, but they've decided to call that possibly. So, yeah, given that there's nothing consistent coming out of the epidemiology, and the stronger research that actually, the animal research, for instance, or the in vitro research, the test tube research, looking at cancer processes or actual cancer in animals, tends to be the best way of getting here, because we can actually control things. And with that, we just don't find that evidence. And that's why the majority of groups say, okay, well, sure, it's possible. Lots of things are possible, but we just don't see any evidence that it's a problem. And we've got a lot of studies that have looked at it. So I really don't think that that's an issue.
Thanks for that. And there's one last question we might try and squeeze in before we wrap up. And to you, Professor Croft, in regards to a specific case, 55,000 microwatts per square metre beaming into a house from a 4G wireless base station, only 82 metres away from the house. Is that, in your view, considered low?
It would depend on the situation, but if it's legally allowed in Australia, yes, it is very low. If they're referring to something which is above the limits, then there's the possibility of it not being innocuous, but it would depend how much above the limits it actually is.
So if somebody wanted to get some more information on that type of specific question, Sarah, would that be something that Talk to the Scientist might be able to help people with?
Yes, absolutely. So if somebody wanted something specific, it's very difficult in a forum like this to do calculations, you know, on the fly. So if somebody wanted something specific, they could definitely contact the Talk to a Scientist program. And if anybody is concerned as well, there are means of, you know, having measurements done. If you're concerned about exposures in your house, it's not something that our PANZA does, but we can certainly point you in the right direction if you would like some clarification of what is happening, you know, in your own home.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate that we've had a lot of questions come in, and a lot of them are detailed, so please follow that advice and use the resources on our PANZA's website and use the Talk to the Scientist service. I'd like to thank our panellists, Dr. Sarah Logren, who is Director of Australian Radiation Protection at the Nuclear Safety Agency, looking after their activities under the government's Enhanced Electromagnetic Energy Program, and Professor Rodney Croft, Director of the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, Centre of Research Excellence into Radio Frequency, Electromagnetic Frequency Health, and Chair of the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation and Protection. Thank you both for your time in talking with us this evening, and thank you especially to all our participants. You'll receive a link to the recording for your future reference, and it will also be on Council's website. And for more information, please visit the PANZA website and use the Talk to the Scientist service. Good evening, and thanks for your time.